Welcome to part one of Basic Manners Open Enrollment Style. I'm Gina Ferris, and joining me today is Veronica Bautel. This is the first of the two-part web seminar where we'll be discussing open enrollment and what it can do for you and your basic manners dog training classes. We will touch on the business side of open enrollment in part two, but today we're going to start with how to develop innovative curriculum that meets the challenges, those many challenges that we face in the classroom. But before we do that, before we get to the nuts and bolts of basic manners classes, I thought you might appreciate knowing just a little bit more about Veronica and myself, and specifically about our background in curriculum development. Veronica holds a master's in education, and she taught curriculum design to teachers at the graduate level before we dog professionals were able to convince her that we're more fun. She continues to teach curriculum design courses, and she provides the curriculum coaching here at DogTech. I'm a former teacher for the San Francisco SPCA's Academy for Dog Trainers. And while there, in addition to teaching public classes, I also ran a mentoring and internship program for trainers who were specializing in classes. And I also do curriculum coaching for DogTech. So that's a little bit about us. Veronica and I became interested in dog training curriculum specifically after watching clients of traditional classes perform really well in class, but then struggling to take what they'd learned and then apply it in everyday life. And so that really does lead us kind of to that first challenge that we have, which is helping our students make that leap from the classroom then into their living room. When you think about all of the challenges that we face as teachers, it's a bit overwhelming. You are constantly faced with on the spot decisions, that you have to make. We struggle to kind of figure out what should we teach and in what order, and we mess with it and play with it and trying to find perfection. We start classes with groups of dogs and people that are invariably at wildly different skill levels. And oh, by the way, we have to keep our students engaged in the class because, unlike school kids, our students can drop out at any time. So, never mind all the business challenges of trying to fill classes and make sure students come to us and getting them to come back for more. We have all of these teaching challenges. So it's no wonder that particularly new trainers that are starting classes feel a bit of anxiety. But these are challenges that we have to meet because if we don't, our businesses suffer. And if our businesses suffer, we can't help as many dogs. So today is all about figuring out how to meet those challenges. What makes a successful class? What are those ingredients that make a class work not just for the students but for the instructor as well? And what does success really mean? And it feels like defining success is a really great place to start. Typically, trainers measure class success based on whether or not students appear to be having a good time. That's one kind of yardstick that we use. We also want them to like us. We really want them to like us as instructors, and so we give out class evaluations at that last night of class, and if those come back good, we feel good about the class. If they don't come back good, we don't feel so good about our performance. That's another yardstick that we typically use. And then I think the big one that most trainers think about is, are the dogs performing? And specifically, are they performing in front of you right now during the class? There's also kind of a third one, and that is just, are you comfortable in the class? Did you feel comfortable? Did you feel like it went well? Again, all of these are kind of the typical yardsticks that trainers use to kind of figure out whether or not their class is successful. But I question whether or not fun is actually the real definition of success. The fact is we can meet all of those goals, meet all of those measurements, and still not have a successful class. So at DogTech, we suggest that you define a successful class based on the client's ability to problem solve. Can they train if you're not right there at their elbow? Can they still get their dog to do what they need them to do? And then not just how does the dog perform in your classroom, but how does he perform at home or out on the street, out in the real world? What's the performance look like? And then, of course, from the business perspective, the ultimate repeat business. And this last one is important because it's important for the health of our business. Healthy businesses get to help more dogs. And so this is not one that we should overlook. You know, as I said, you really can hit those lesser goals of having fun and the people liking you and still not have a successful business. If you don't have repeat business, you can miss out on hundreds or thousands of dollars depending on the size of your class program. When we work with clients, they're often shocked when we add up the difference between their program as it is and their program if they had a good retention program, meaning more people coming back and taking classes. So we work on retention not just as a reflection to improve that bottom line, but again because it also means that they're helping more dogs. They're helping more people and their dogs. So repeat business is a good gauge for a successful class program. Why do students say they loved class, they had a great time, their evaluation is glowing, but then they don't come back for more? What's the real problem there? And when we look at it, what we see is its lack of real life results. So when you get your evaluation on graduation night, that's a reflection of how they felt in that moment in the classroom. But if they took their dog home after a 6-week basic class and their dog chewed the shoes, as this one is so lovely doing, or the couch, or what have you, they're not going to feel like the class was successful any longer. So while they may have thought it was great in the moment, if that dog's behavior doesn't meet their expectations at home, for them the class isn't going to be successful. Really just classic example of this, I was talking about how Veronica and I came to develop curriculum. One of the things that we did was we were sitting and watching a class at the SPCA, kind of just a traditional basic class, and we were watching on graduation night, and these students were rocking it. They were so good. They were doing their stays, and their owners could do these long distance stays, and they could wait at the door and sit and down, just everything as a trainer of a basic class you would feel so good about. And then we watched them go to their cars. If you haven't done this, I would challenge you to do it with your own classes. Watch them after they've left the building. And we watched this one woman in particular who was just struggling. She had a large dog. He was pulling her out the door, and she couldn't get the keys in the lock, and she was just so clearly frustrated. And not one time did she ask for a sit or her wait, or she just clearly walked out the door and forgot everything that she had just learned. And so what we saw was that in order for these classes to be successful, what they do inside the room isn't nearly as important as what they do outside of the classroom. But why is it? Why is it not translating to success? Why couldn't she think to put her dog in that beautiful sit stay she had just used? We trainers often talk about dogs don't generalize well. Well, after watching classroom students, I would argue that people don't generalize really well either. So when we fail to teach them in context, we start to see that the behavior on their part, their application skills fall apart because we haven't taught them in class. And so we're going to talk about that quite a bit today. Before we do that, though, we are here to talk about open enrollment classes specifically. So what are some of the advantage of those? It's great to teach a real-world class, but why would you turn it into an open enrollment class? We started with open enrollment puppy for some really specific reasons, a few of them being that we really didn't want puppies to miss out on their socialization window. And we saw that with our clients, trainers were seeing puppies go to the competition because they didn't have a class starting for several weeks. So as business coaches, we were like, oh, we need to fix that problem. And open enrollment did that really nicely for puppy. But what we very quickly got when lots of trainers were using that curriculum were phone calls about, okay, where's the basic? Where's the basic curriculum? And we realized that the advantages of open enrollment don't just work for puppy, they work for basic as well, because some of the advantage of open enrollment classes are things like it's more convenient for students, which gives people a reason to choose you over your competition, your class versus someone else's class. So that's really important. It's also easier scheduling for instructors, in particular if you're looking at like open enrollment versus something like levels or drop-in classes. Open enrollment is a little easier to get your arms around the scheduling. The other thing that we realized that was really strong about the open enrollment puppy that could be used in BASIC is the fact that open enrollment handles the fact that people come in at different skill levels and experience levels. It has to. Just by its nature, and we're going to show you how it does that. But that's definitely a strength of open enrollment. And then, of course, we were seeing increased business for our trainers who were using the open enrollment puppy. So it made all kinds of sense then to look at BASIC. So that's what we did. We created some open enrollment BASIC, and then some trainers throughout the country have been using that for a while. Okay, so before we get too far, I do want to make sure we're all on the same page about when we define open enrollment, because that term isn't really well defined in our industry. Open enrollment means that students can join at any time. So if the class is a 6-lesson class, they could take lessons 1 through 6 in that order, or they could start with lesson 3, 4, 5, 6, and then take 1, 2. So they still take them in a row, but they don't necessarily have to start with 1. And the reason for that is because each session is self-contained. The lessons, the different behaviors aren't taught by building over multiple sessions. They build in a single session. And we are going to actually take a look at what that looks like here in just a bit. It sounds great. But it's not quite as easy as it looks. Open enrollment meets many of those teaching challenges that we talked about earlier, but it also brings with it some challenges of its own. So we want to make sure you're just aware of those. Word of caution about those. We have a tendency with open enrollment, if your curriculum isn't a strong curriculum, to kind of double down on focusing your class on specific dog behaviors. Sit, down, stay. Rather than looking at the handler skills. And that just has to do with people starting at different times. I think it's just easier to think about, well, what am I teaching the dog? If you're not careful handling all those different skills, again, if you don't have a strong curriculum behind you, it's going to be easy for it to kind of devolve into mini private sessions where you teach everybody a little bit differently based on where they're at. And that causes people to not come back because you lose the cohesiveness of a class. That's the advantage of a class versus a private session. Part of that advantage is the cohesiveness and the collegiality that you're getting through a class. And so if you just teach it like many private sessions, you lose the power of having a class. Okay. So how do we handle everyone starting from such different places? In a basic manners class, you may have that unruly adolescent that was just adopted a couple of weeks ago sitting right next to the 6-year-old golden that's slowing down and is just taking a class to get out for a bit. You will have handlers who have all kinds of experience. You'll have those who have had dogs for a long time, those who it's their first dog. You may have some people come to class who are really excited about new technology and they can't wait to use a clicker. And then in this very same class, you may have someone who can't figure out how to hold the clicker and the leash at the same time. So in basic, all ages, all skill levels, you can just never really know what you're going to get. And that's a challenge that all teachers face, not just in dog training classes. We see it in our public school systems as well. And in the public school system, their way of dealing with these different skill levels in the past has been to really stratify classes, just offering more of them, trying to get everybody, all the kids lumped together so that they're at the exact same level, in the hopes that it'll be easier to teach. So we've got special ed, and we've got remedial, and we've got basic, and we've got college prep, but then there's advanced placement. All of these just keep breaking it down smaller and smaller and smaller, trying to find kids that are exactly the same. And guess what? We don't do that very well. We do the same thing as dog trainers. For the most part, we tend to emulate that system. We end up with things like basic 1 and 2, intermediate 1 and 2, advanced 1 and 2. And again, It's our attempt to try to get everybody coming in at about the same place so that they're easier to teach. But to even ask the question a bit about, handling varied skill levels is a bit of a red herring. It's the wrong question. People, and particularly when we're working with people and their dogs, are always going to have different skill levels. Think about it. We did not start kindergarten as blank slates. We had 5 years of prior learning. Some of us may have been formal, others not, but we didn't just sit in the crib for 5 years. We learned stuff. So even at level 1, we come in at different levels. And if you take a look at, again, students and their dogs, they're never going to be blank slates either. They have had some history before they see you of some kind. So no matter how you try to break those classes down, you're not going to get around that. So then, really the solution isn't to break up the classes. The solution is to have good curriculum that accommodates all those different skill levels. Good curriculum is going to address the fact that everyone comes in with a different skill level, and that's going to be part of the curriculum, not the structure of the class. We want to make structural decisions like, what are we going to teach and when are we going to teach it? We base that on the needs of the business because that means we're basing it on the needs of our students. But the curriculum is going to handle the fact that everybody starts at a different place, and that's okay. We don't all have to be the same. We also need curriculum that focuses on students and what students and dogs are able to do, not so much what they can't do. We want to figure out where they're starting from. And that means our goals really should primarily focus on the human understanding and skill. I don't understand why we put so much emphasis on what the dog can do, because as a trainer, I know I can get a lot of great behavior from a dog and hand it back to their owner and then not get very far if I don't help them out. On the other hand, I can take someone who doesn't know much about training, teach them how to train, and give them almost any dog, and they'll see some success if they're doing it right. If we are training correctly, the dog's behavior is going to come along for the ride. So our goals really need to focus on that human side of the equation much more. Our goal should be to teach people to work at their own level and to make improvements from there. We understand that they're going to come in with different skill levels, and they also come in with different goals as well. So our goals for the class needs to be to help them move where they want to go, not to get everybody to do the exact same thing. That's not even one of their goals. We want to focus on what they need to get out of class. If we've done a good job, we can give our students typical everyday situations, and they're going to be able to handle them even without our help. So they may not handle every situation exactly the same, but they will be able to handle it. And that's what we're looking for from a successful class. Not that everyone progresses at the same pace, but that everyone can participate in all of the activities at whatever level they are at. I think in Montessori they call that your just right level. Work at your just right level. And Montessori's been working this way for a long time, where you've got kids of various age groups in a classroom, and they learn to work at their level and not focus on what everyone else is doing. So it's kind of the new Montessori approach, if you will, for dog training. The next thing the open enrollment curriculum has to do to be successful is to help students be successful outside of the classroom. And Veronica is going to explain a little bit how to build curriculum that really does that.
Well, if our goal is success outside the classroom, as Gina says, we need a new approach to life inside the classroom to make that happen. And in traditional education, typically traditional approaches to dog training classrooms, we think of curriculum as a list of behaviors to teach. So, very often if you go into a training studio and you ask to look at any particular trainer's curriculum, what you're handed is a list of which behaviors are taught on which evening or which session. And then because the focus is on teaching behavior, then the assessment of whether students are successful, of whether the dog is successful, and whether the trainer is successful, is all based on whether or not the dog is performing behavior in the classroom. And as Gina says, the story that she told about the class at the SPCA, which I'm sure probably, rang very familiar to us all, then that means it doesn't matter too much whether the dogs are getting success inside the classroom if we're not seeing it outside. And generally, when we focus our curriculum on helping people get their dogs to do certain specific behaviors in a classroom, what we end up seeing outside is that poor success and compliance for all of the reasons that Gina has been talking about. And so what we want instead is a completely different approach that really focuses on life outside. And in this approach, based on constructivist learning theory, which is a curriculum, an instructional way of thinking in the education world, rather than when we apply that to dog training classes, rather than focusing on behaviors to teach, the curriculum is going to be focused on skill and concept goals for real-life application. As Gina says, we're going to teach our students to think a little bit more like dog trainers, because if they're thinking a little bit more like dog trainers, then they are going to have higher success outside the classroom when they're facing new situations and we aren't standing there next to them to help. And so what we're looking for to judge whether we've been successful as instructors and whether our students are doing well is their ability to problem solve real-life types of situations and to make adjustments and go from there. And so if we're going to do this, if we're going to say, okay, curriculum is all about what is going to happen when someone leaves our classroom, and if what we're looking for is high compliance and success rate in the real world, then we'll need to build that curriculum around what students need to know and are able to do when they leave the classroom. So if we're going to go this direction, the first thing we need to figure out is what skills and concepts we're going to teach them, because this list of behaviors is just not a curriculum. It doesn't constitute curriculum. Curriculum is the entirety of what we teach and how we teach it. And a list of behaviors isn't going to get the job done, partly because, again, dogs being able to do behaviors in the classroom doesn't necessarily mean any translation out into the real world if we're not helping students think about how to do that. So if it's about living in the real world successfully with their dogs, we'll have to decide what knowledge and skill sets we want students to leave our classroom with. So our first step then as curriculum designers is to identify our course goals. Course goals are the concepts and skills we want to teach. They're what we want students to know and be able to do by the time they finish our classroom. Our open enrollment basic manners class is built on 7 course goals, and we're going to go through those as a sample to show you what course goals might look like. And so I'm going to run you through these, and I want you to start thinking, and I'm going to try to show you this, but I want you to start thinking ahead about how different this is. When you set up a classroom thinking, okay, I have to teach sit, I have to teach wait, I have to teach loose leash walking, you're going to get a really, really different curriculum than when you say, okay, I need to teach a class that teaches people these concepts and skills. People. I'm going to teach the people. So the first thing we want them to know is we want them to have a basic understanding of how dogs learn, because we know ourselves as trainers that basic understanding influences everything we do, every decision we make with dogs. And so we want them to have a little bit of a sense of that, especially because that's going to help us bring them along with our methodological preferences as well. We want students to understand the basic physical and mental stimulation needs of their dogs. Basically, we want them to understand that a bored and under-exercised dog is going to be more difficult to live with and more difficult to train, and understand that providing some exercise and basic mental stimulation is going to make not only the dog's life better, but really the ways in which it's going to make the people's lives better, because unfortunately, I think most people are more motivated to do that if it's going to impact their own comfort. And then we start getting into some of the more active pieces here. So one of the things we want our students to walk out of class understanding is what is reinforcing for their particular dogs and how they can use that to get what they want, to get the behaviors that they want and to stop the behaviors that they don't. And so the ideas of positive reinforcement, the ideas of reward removal, of not reinforcing behavior you don't like. If a dog is barking at you to throw the tennis ball, perhaps picking up the tennis ball is a better choice than throwing the tennis ball, these sorts of things. And then the concept of say please, of basically, asking dogs to, to use the Premack principle, and if you'd like this, then can you do this for me, as a way of saying please. And so we use a lot of these sorts of things in the curriculum. And a big part of this, of course, is because it's one thing to teach people about positive reinforcement and hope that they stop punishing their dogs, but it's another thing entirely to give them skill sets that allow them to make those good choices. We want students to know how to get control of their dogs in the distracting situation. I think a lot of times in curriculum we wait too long to teach this. We teach all the basics, and we try to teach everything devoid of distraction, and we only add distraction in more later advanced classes. But, of course, students are living with distraction their entire lives, all the time. As soon as they leave the classroom, they're back in the classroom itself is a tremendously distracting situation when it comes right down to it. But as soon as we send them out into the world and their homes are full of distraction. And so to teach them this right from the beginning, to give them strategies for working around distraction. Situational awareness, of course, is a huge one. Actively, not just telling students that it's important to be aware of their environment and pay attention to what might be distracting their dogs, but designing lessons and curriculum that actively promote this skill set, where people are looking around the environment. They are noticing when their dog's behavior changes and looking for cues in the environment to what might have facilitated that change, that as they get better at it, they start to notice things hopefully before their dogs do and can take proactive action, but that they understand the role of distraction, and they understand it's basically, I always think about it as when we learn to drive cars, that part of what we have to learn to do is to look way ahead down the road and to remember to look in the rearview mirror and the side mirror and in front and all around, and that once you become a strong driver, you're doing these things automatically without even having to think about it. And we want our students to do the same thing when they're in the world with their dogs. This is a critical one. This flows strongly throughout all of our curriculum development, and most of the lessons in the curriculum have some element of this. Many of them are focused very heavily on it. Basically, what we're talking about here is criteria setting, proofing, rate of reinforcement, these sorts of things. But what all of that really means to an owner in real life is working at the dog's level, is understanding the impact of the environment, and then being able to set reasonable expectations for their dogs given what's going on in the world. We want people to not ask for a 25-minute sit when the dog's really at a 5-second sit-stay level, right? We want people to recognize that getting a perfect heel when there are terribly distracting things around may not be at her level. What could we do to help her be successful instead? That what we're really looking for here is that people are able to ask for the right level of behavior so that they can continue to grow that behavior, and that when the dog is struggling, that they know what to do to adjust so that they can get successful repetition and move forward from there. And this is a really big part of what Gina was talking about, with the idea that we can all approach the same activities, but at our own level. This is a really important piece, and that they're thinking, about their own dogs. And then problem solving, being able to take the things that they're learning in class and apply them to new situations. If we don't teach this, we are never going to have the success outside the classroom that we'd like to see, because as Gina pointed out, we're not terribly good generalizers, which is not a surprise given the way our human education system is set up, where we are not taught in an interdisciplinary way, and we're not actively taught in most cases to apply learning from one area to another. The bell rings every 50 minutes, and we tend, unfortunately, to learn to compartmentalize things. And so this is a really key piece because we can't be there with students, and so we can't be there to say, oh gosh, remember that thing we did in class? You could do this, and to recognize that that probably isn't going to happen unless we actively teach that skill set. So these are the goals that the basic our open enrollment basic manners is based on, and then we're going to talk a little bit later in this session about what this looks like in action. How do what does a curriculum based on these goals look like? But before we do that, I have one more little thing to talk to you about, and then Gina's going to talk to us about sort of how we go about using these goals to build a curriculum. If you look at these 7 goals that we've just taken a look at, and if you're focusing on teaching people key concepts and skills like this, that necessarily means less focus on teaching behavior. Now, as Gina said, the behaviors will come along for the ride because they're still working on something, and we're working on behaviors in class. And as the students are learning these skill sets, their dogs, they're getting more and more proficient at teaching their dogs these cues. So they're going to come along for the ride. But because we are spending so much time teaching these skill sets in this really active way, we don't have as much room for behaviors. And so we're going to teach fewer of them. And that's one thing you'll notice about our curriculum is that whereas a typical dog training curriculum might introduce, as many as 12 or more cues, we're probably going to be working more around half a dozen or so. And one of the things that's very interesting if you're in the education world is there's always this debate about depth versus breadth. So in thinking about, a literature class, for example, do we have students read 20 novels so that they're exposed to a wide, variety of the canon, or do we read, 4 novels really, really closely so that they learn those books very well, and more importantly, they're learning how to read, really, really how to read a novel, read critically, and see all the depths and the layers and things like that. Most dog training classes tend to go for breadth, lots and lots of cues. We're going to teach watch, and we're going to teach sit and down and stay and come and loose leash walking and target and on and on and on. We tend to go instead for depth. We say we're going to teach fewer cues, but students are going to come out of class with those cues much more heavily proofed. So they're going to leave with fewer, but they're going to be much more useful to them in real life. They're going to be much more reliable. And one of the things that we've learned to sort of rely on or watch for over the years is something that we've dubbed universal cue. And this started back at the SPCA when we designed the very first dog training curriculum that Gina and I put together, real life based. Back then we weren't thinking open enrollment. None of that had kind of happened yet. This was longer ago than I care to admit, actually. And one of the things we noticed is back then we were doing all this real life stuff, but we were still teaching tons and tons of cues. And so we were teaching really long classes. But it was interesting. We noticed that every time we put people into a real-life challenge situation where we said, okay, now you're going to apply all these things you've learned and figure out how to handle this or this or this, we noticed that most of the students would pick one behavior and they would use it for everything. So if the challenge was to walk by trash on the ground, if the challenge was to walk by another dog, if the challenge was to ignore a new dog who'd come into the room, whatever it happened to be, one student would use watch for all of it. One student would use leave it for all of it. One student would use target or would use calm or would use, whatever their sit, whatever theirs was. And we realized that what they were doing was defaulting to the behavior that was strongest for them, that was most reliable, that they felt safest asking for. And it occurred to us at that moment that pet dog trainers or pet dog owners do not need 12 or 15 cues. They need a small number of really reliable ones that they can get in high distraction situations. And so that's one of the reasons that we tend to teach fewer behavior, because we're really, really focused on a good relationship between the dog and the owner in the real world. Okay, with that said, and taking a look at these 7 goals we've got, the next piece now is to look at, all right, well, you've got your goals. What do you do with them? And Gina's going to walk us through that.
Yes, so once you have goals for the class, it's time for my favorite part, planning. And the first step in planning is always to define your goal. Think about what you want your students to know and to be able to do as a result of your class, as Veronica said, and then keep these goals in mind, and keep in mind that these goals, again, as Veronica has said a couple times, is about handlers. These are goals about the handlers. They're not dog-centered goals. Okay. So if we look at this first piece of planning, the defining the goals, a couple things to think about here. If your goals aren't clear, you're going to end up with a class that moves from one behavior to the next without any real cohesiveness or without any context, any real-world context to it. If people don't generalize well, then you can teach them all the behaviors in the world, but they're still not able to use them in real life. So you have to be careful about that. We can't assume that just because we've taught them sit, that when they go to leave the class, that they'll think to ask their dog to sit before he dashes through the door to leave. If we really want them to get that concept, we need to practice at the door. Okay, and step 2 then is determining your evidence. How will you know that your students are getting it? Some examples of this might be things like classroom discussion. For instance, whenever we give students a big kind of intricate challenge, and you're going to see an example of that in a little bit, like playing out a scene of someone coming over for coffee, then we often start with a discussion where we ask questions like, what will you do to keep your dog from barking at the doorbell? Or what are you going to do to make sure your dog is successful? These open-ended questions, because we're using that discussion as an evaluation of whether or not, A, they're ready for the challenge, but also have they got the concepts? Can they start to do the problem solving for themselves? If they can't do it without trying to manage the dog at the same time, there's no way they're going to be able to do it when they're actually in the middle of the challenge with the dog. So this is a good chance for us to do a little assessment. Have they got the concepts that we've been talking about? You can also then use your observations in class. And I think as trainers, it's really easy to fall into the habit of thinking about what you have to do next and all of those teaching decisions that you have to make. And then you send them out to practice, and then you focus. You observe then. You observe practice time. But then we forget to observe those other moments in class, the transitions, when they come to and from an exercise, when they're coming in the classroom or leaving. And those are some of your most valuable observation opportunities. If what you're hoping for, let's say one of the concepts that you're working on is rate of reinforcement. You want them to be able to reward quickly and frequently. The best time to check that probably isn't even during an exercise necessarily. It might be that when you are sitting and talking and having a class lecture, that you're also paying attention to they're able to keep their dogs quiet, that they are rewarding quickly and frequently enough, and so the dogs are staying quiet. So that's an observation moment. You can observe, what do they do when they come in the front door or when they leave? Do they think to shut the door and practice reward removal if their dog is barging forward? So look at, I just call them real life moments. So not just practice time, but use those times in between practice to determine how they're doing on some of the larger concepts of class. Obviously, you observe them during practice too. Just don't lose out on those moments that are a little closer to real life. So those are a couple of ways that are good for kind of figuring out whether or not your students are meeting those big, large learning goals that you've set for them. All right, the third step then is to plan what you're going to teach. This is where you decide which behaviors. So notice we have quite a bit we have several steps before we get to choosing what behaviors we're going to teach. That's almost last on the list. Rather than choosing sit because you think everybody should know sit, you're going to choose the behaviors that best illustrate those learning goals that you're trying to teach. And it will help you to make some choices about what you teach and what you don't. Do you need a watch and a leave it? Do you need sit and down in order to meet your goals for the students? Maybe you do and maybe you don't. But the beauty of having these goals in place is it helps you as an instructor make those decisions from some place, as opposed to just kind of in the spur of the moment without any real thought behind it. Your goals are always going to determine how you make those choices, so the choices get easier to make. Okay. But in order for all this to work, we mentioned earlier self-contained lesson planning, so I want to make sure that we touch on that. Once the goals are in place and we're planning, this is one of the challenges that open enrollment has, or how it meets some of its challenges. You've got to be able to plan a lesson within a single session as opposed to planning it across 4, 5, or 6, having it build throughout. It's got to build within a single session. If we look at how classes are traditionally taught, we maybe we lure in week 1 a sit, and maybe in week 2 we fade the lure, and in week 3 we put on a verbal cue. And while that may be how we teach as trainers, it doesn't always work for our students because they're not living in a lab and they're needing sits in between time. And with open enrollment, because they don't necessarily start in that order. Again, they may start at week 3 instead of week 1. We can't do that. We can't spread it across weeks. We've got to do it in a single session. So for self-contained lesson planning, you're gonna build skills and apply them. So we're going to teach them, and then we're going to get them applying it right away, because we know how important that is within a single session. And we're going to take a look at some examples here in a minute. We're going to you can still build. We're going to do it within a single session rather than over weeks, basically. We're also going to organize our skills around real-life themes, as Veronica was saying. That is a big part of helping people to generalize, is giving them real-life situations. Teach them the concept and then give them a situation to handle and see if they can do it. And then we're going to use exercises that fit lots of different skill levels. So we don't all have to be starting from the same place. I can have a student who's luring a sit, and I can have a student who already has sit on verbal, and they're going to a verbal cue, and they're both going to be able to do and get something from the exact same exercise. They don't have to be at the same place. It doesn't matter. The challenge of the exercise will be for them to work at their level. And again, we're gonna take a look at that in just a minute. In fact, Veronica is going to walk us through an example from the Basic Manners Open Enrollment curriculum.
Okay, so let's look at some examples here. Now, this is a very stripped down overview of one session out of the Basic Manners our Open Enrollment curriculum. Now, in this session, the 2 goals we're working on the most. Now, this is a bit stripped down, so some of these lesson plans will have other goals mixed in as well, but for simplicity's sake here, we're really going to focus on working at the dog's level and on problem solving, which basically means real-world application, so that people are able to take what they're learning at the beginning of class, and those people who have been around for a few weeks, who have been in the open enrollment course for a while, they're also going to be applying what they've learned in past sessions to some real-life situations and have the challenge of already starting to think right from the beginning and ongoing, how do I use this out in real life? Because one of the things I think is really important to point out here is that you can tell people how to use things in real life, but that's not teaching them. So you can say, gosh, we did this weight, so you could use it at the door and you could use it on the curb and you could use it, but telling people that has a really, really low rate of actual compliance and use in the real world. People have to practice those skill sets, practice thinking those applications through themselves if we're going to expect them to do them. Now, in each of our sessions, we've got a theme, and in this case, the theme is company for coffee, and what we're really talking about is just handling people coming over, handling doorbells, handling guests in the house, things like that. And so that's our real-life context theme. And our behavior vehicles. We're going to be focusing on sit, using sits to combat jumping, and downs. So these are the behaviors that we're working on in this particular session. Now, this is a really simple stripped-down session overview. We start every class by talking with people about catching their dogs getting it right, and basically this is a little lesson at the beginning that's about what happens if the dogs become distracted, what happens if one dog in class barks, what happens if somebody arrives late, what happens if back in our SPCA days, if kids are flying by right outside the classroom on skateboards. And in this case, and we're giving people just concrete skills for how to handle those situations. And in this case, we're applying that question specifically to the doorbell. You know, how do we help dogs handle sudden sounds? And then we have a sit lesson plan, an anti-jumping sit to greet lesson plan, and a down lesson plan. And all of these we're not going to focus as much on these today. We're really going to focus on these challenge activities. But one of the things you'll definitely notice in our curriculum is that we break away from the old explain, demo, practice model. You know, you think about so many dog training classes, explain, demo, practice, next behavior, explain, demo, practice, next behavior, explain, demo, practice. And part of why we're trying to break away from that model is that we all that does is teach behavior instead of teaching these concepts and skills. And so, you know, so often things are just they're too contextless to be of use to people. But at any rate, we do these lessons, and then the class culminates in a challenge. Every session culminates in a challenge. So if we've learned these behaviors and we started to practice these behaviors and all of the concepts that those lessons were actually designed to teach, working at the dog's level, problem solving, then let's work on applying what we've learned to having visitors over for coffee. And so we set up a lesson where the students sort of essentially pretend visit each other. They have to handle answering the door, handling the visit, and they each have to figure out how they're going to do that. So we're going to look at that in some detail, and this is just a picture of that lesson plan. I'm going to change the screen here so that we can look at this in detail. We've broken it down for you a little bit so I can walk you through it, and just wait for this to load. So now here what you're going to see is we've just taken little bits step by step of the lesson plan and pulled them out one page each here so that you can take a look on your screen. So the first thing, all of our lessons always start with the course goals. You know, what is this lesson about? What are we trying to accomplish? And then we talk a little bit about the behaviors and the skills and the concepts, and more specifically, catching dogs getting it right. We're going to work sits, downs, anti-jump, sit to greet, reward removal, working at the dog's level, real-life application, and then we talk specifically, what are we looking for? As Gina says, how do we know that students have been successful? So we know they've been successful if they catch their dogs getting it right, which means that they actually reinforce something that the dog has done well without an instructor having to remind them to do it, that they are making good decisions to work at their dog's level. They're not asking their dogs to do something that's too advanced for them, and that if they realize that the dog is struggling with something, that they make unprompted adjustments to work at the dog's level. So what I'm really looking for, and I'm not expecting it of anyone who's there for the first evening, I'm going to be doing a lot of prompting for them. We'll talk about that in a bit. But what I'm looking for as my students are with me a little bit longer is I want to see them ask for ask for a down, for example, realize the dog is distracted, having difficulty with it for whatever reason, and say, what can I do about this, and have them back up and try again, or do some body blocking, or change the dog's orientation to move away from the distraction. Can they make an adjustment on their own without being prompted? Because that's ultimately, that's what they need to be able to do out in the real world. And then their timing. So these are the things that we're looking for as we watch students practice. We start with an intro discussion. So we say, hey, challenge today is to have a guest or two over for coffee. got to get them through the door, without the dogs going crazy, a nice polite greeting, and then enjoy your company while your dog's relaxed. And then we say, let's review what we've done today to get ready for that. And so what we're doing there is we're saying we've got a series of discussion questions here. What will help you to keep your dog from barking when the doorbell rings? Because we've already done an exercise on that, so it's just a matter of asking them to recall, gosh, right, what do I know that I could use in a situation like this? Thinking about your dog and working at her level, what will you do to help her, keep her from jumping on your guests? And what are you going to do to help your dog lie down successfully while you visit? And a lot of this is them thinking about, okay, well, where am I going to put my dog in relation to the guest? Am I going to take my dog to the door, or I'm going to have my dog wait at her seat instead? How am I going to handle this? Because one of the things you'll notice about how we do our challenges is we don't tell people what to do. We don't say, when the doorbell rings, tell your dog this, now do this, now walk to the doorbell and blah, blah, blah. We don't do that because if we do that, people don't learn to make those decisions on their own. We can't stand there at home telling them what to do when someone comes to the door. So this is really an opportunity for them to practice the skill set of, okay, given what I've learned earlier in this session, and if I've been here in previous sessions, given what I've learned in those, how could I handle this? How do I want this to look, and what do I think my dog is capable of? So we have this discussion so that some ideas are flowing, people are sort of formulating their plans, and then we do the challenge. So if you are one of those trainers that are fortunate enough to have a nice, beautiful, large studio, and you've got living room setups and things like that, absolutely fantastic. If you are not so fortunate and you're teaching out of someone else's space, or I was talking to a trainer yesterday who teaches out of 4 different spaces and has all of her chairs in her car and whatnot, no matter what you're doing, you can do these sorts of setups. It's just a matter of putting down a couple of chairs to delineate living room space, maybe a strip of blue painter's tape on the floor to approximate a door. In this case, those will already be on the ground because we used them for the earlier sit to greet exercise in this session. And then if you have assistants, they can play visitors, extra students can play visitors, you can play visitors, and the students go around and visit each other and try out the plans that they formulated. And our job is to reinforce students for good decisions and any unprompted actions that they took, and then to prompt the students who need a little bit of help to help them along so that they're successful at their level as well. Then we stop and we do a debrief, and this is a critically important piece and something that's really missing, I think, from most dog training curriculums, is that learning happens when we reflect on an experience. And we very rarely take the time to stop and create that reflection space in our classrooms, an opportunity to say, okay, what worked, what didn't work, what was difficult, what surprised me, what did my dog do better than I thought she might, what was more challenging for her, and given what happened, what might I do differently next time? It's such a critical question, and if we don't teach people to think that way, in other words, to think like a trainer, they won't. And so there has to be space in the classroom for this kind of thinking, to model it and to give people an opportunity to actually actively practice it, that every time we try something new, we stop and say, how'd that go? What did I learn? And then we give them an opportunity to apply that learning. And so the next step is to go back and have a different visit. So we did one visit, and now we're going to do it again. We're each going to visit someone and be visited, and we're going to repeat this challenge, and so that we have an opportunity to try to put some new learning into place. We had that reflection discussion. What did we get from it? What good ideas did we get from other people, hearing what other people tried? Oh, gosh, I want to do that now, too. We get the opportunity to go back and do it again, and then have another brief discussion about what we did differently. Was it more successful than last? What ideas do you have for next time when someone comes to your house? And I think a really critical question, in what other sorts of situations could you use what you learned and practiced today? Because most of us have the temptation to tell people the answer to that question. You can also, these things we just worked on today, you can also use in this way, in this way, in this way. But telling people something has a much, much lower retention rate than them having the idea themselves. And so asking that question, getting people to think, oh, yeah, okay, what I learned here, what we did here, and what other sorts of real-life situations would this be applicable? How else could I use this? And getting them to answer that question and think about it actively, they're much, much more likely to see the connection and much more likely to act on it in real life. Okay, so that's just a little bit of an overview of what one of these challenges looks like, just to give you a bit of a sense of that. Now, I said earlier that curriculum is the sum total of what you're going to teach and how you're going to teach it. And we showed you a little bit about, what a lesson plan looks like, and you can see in the way we do our lesson plans that it really is quite detailed, because we're really wanting to make sure that when we design something that we really are designing the lesson to teach what we mean it to teach. But then the other part of this is the instructional piece itself. The way we interact with students is also part of curriculum, and that's what we're going to talk about next, is as we are implementing this curriculum, what decisions are we making as we interact with our students. Scaffolding is an education term that basically means we provide a lot of support in the beginning. As people are learning something new, we slowly remove that support so that by the time we're done, by the time someone graduates from one of our classes, they are standing on their own 2 feet and they are making real-life decisions on their own without us having to do it for them. And one of the big mistakes that we tend to make as trainers is constantly telling people what to do. Now do this, now do this, now do this. And we essentially, on accident, teach learned helplessness, that people don't learn to make good decisions for themselves because they're waiting for us to tell them what to do. And it makes sense that we do it this way and that they expect that, because that's essentially how our education system is designed, and part of why people aren't good generalizers. So we're going to talk about some ways to scaffold, and I really think that scaffolding is essentially, I think a really close analogy is proofing. So proofing for real life. There are 4 things that we can do as instructors, and I'm going to go through each of these individually. The first one, then, is to create opportunities for students to practice in authentic contexts. And so what we mean by that is to break away from the explain, demo, practice, explain, demo, practice, explain, demo, practice mode, and to actually actively teach students the skill sets they need to make decisions in real life. And so if you take a look, looks like that didn't load, unfortunately. Gotta love tech problems. Hopefully you have it on your end. If not, we'll make sure that you get it. So what's supposed to be here on this slide is an at-a-glance of our open enrollment basic manners class. And the reason we're showing an at-a-glance here is just to illustrate that every single session is built around some real-life context. So we showed you the company for coffee one, and and as we do all of the lessons in that, getting ready for that culminating challenge at the end, it's all focused around that notion of people coming to the doors. All of the lesson plans have some component of that, visitors, things like that, so that we're ready for it. Some of the other, we've got one session that's all focused around the home office, by which we just mean being able to, having a dog who allows you to focus when you need to, whether you're sitting and reading, whether you actually work from home, or you're sitting and reading email, or you're wanting to sit and enjoy a movie, cook dinner, just, whatever you need to do to sort of focus, and to know that your dog is happily and gainfully occupied during those times. We have one that's focused around successful leash walks, one that's focused around successful trips to a park or any other sort of high distraction situation. We have one focused around dinner time, both the human dinner time and the dog dinner time. And in all of those, we are teaching concrete behaviors, and in our curriculum, all behaviors are taught at least twice, cycle back around through at least a couple of sessions. And so just to sort of understand that that everything we do is built around some sort of a real-life context. The second one, I've talked about this a bit already, catching dogs and people getting it right, but it's not just when we're doing a lesson plan about that. It's all the time. That part of our job as instructors is to notice when students reinforce their dog for something without being prompted to do it, to reinforce the skills and concepts that we're teaching every time we have a chance to do that. And you'll see, I'm going to show you in a moment an example of what that might look like. And remembering, it's one of the things that's so challenging as a teacher is that you're constantly making decisions. I remember back in my education days, there was a really, really fascinating study that talked about the number of decisions that a teacher makes in a given they thought they were going to study in an hour, and they realized that it was so many that they kind of refocused it down to a single minute, 60 seconds. And I unfortunately don't remember the number, but it was mind-boggling. I mean, we're constantly making decisions: who to make eye contact with, what part of the classroom to face, who to go speak to. When we go out, when we go out and people are practicing, and we've sent them out to do something, and we have to decide who are we going to go talk to. We have to decide whether we're going to say anything to someone when we've watched them, what we're going to say to them, what we're going to give them feedback about. I mean, there's 10,000 things we could say, tons of things we could focus on. But a good instructor will remember that they base their curriculum on a set of goals for a reason, and they will make sure that their feedback is specific to the goals that they're trying to teach for that lesson. And so we're wanting to remember always we're focusing in on the goals that we're teaching. And one of the things that we do in our curriculum is we actually have an assistance handbook, which is actually something that is used by instructors as well, where for every single lesson in the curriculum, we have a page where we say, okay, here are the goals that are for this lesson. So here's the company for coffee. These are the things that we're supposed to be teaching, and so these are the things we're supposed to be reinforcing. So we have this box here again, and then we actually give specific examples to assistants, and helpful for instructors as well, for what they might say, what they're looking for, and what they might say. So if one of the things we're supposed to reinforce is catching their dogs getting it right, things like great job treating her before she barked at the doorbell, or great job letting your dog know she's doing a good job keeping all four on the floor. You're really catching her getting it right. Or if you need to prompt, we also have prompt suggestions. Be sure to tell her she's doing a good job. That will help her to keep getting it right. Be sure to keep her rear on the ground. So if the dog is sitting for to greet the company, and the student has failed to reinforce, that we go in and we prompt that. And so really, learning a way of reinforcing that's very specific to the goals, so that they're more likely to be learned. And then the fourth tip here for proofing for real life is to fade the prompting. And this is where where I think all of the rubber hits the road here. We have to remember that, we're always saying to ourselves, well, the trainer doesn't live with the dog, but the trainer doesn't live with the people either. And that is so critical. We don't live with them. We have them for an hour a week, and then they go about all the rest of the hours in their week without us. And so we must learn to stop telling people what to do all the time, so that they can learn how to do it themselves. That is the whole focus of our curriculum, is to help people learn how to make good decisions in real life with their dogs. And so I'm going to show you what this looks like. Because one of the things, and these are techniques that can be used, obviously in a linear class as well, but one of the extra challenges in an open enrollment class is that we've got people who are here for the first time, and we've got people who are here for the fifth time. I mean, we've got brand new people, and we've got, 6 people who are here for the sixth time. They're graduating, and everything in between. And so we have to sort of understand this scaffolding progression, so that we can always be thinking about where in the where are we with each student. So the first step is direct instruction. We've got a brand new student who's in there for the first time. We are probably going to tell them what to do. So we're going to say something like, Fido is distracted by that other dog who just came into the room. Let's try backing up to create more distance to help work at Fido's level. Right, and really look at this language, because I'm not just saying, oh, hey, there's a dog over there, let's back up a little bit. I'm really specifically saying to help work at Fido's level. I mean, we're using the language of the goals over and over and over again, to help people really focus in. So I noticed that her dog's having a hard time. I noticed that she's not responding or not seeming to know what to do. That's no surprise. She's just started class. I'm going to go over there and give her a specific suggestion to help her out. And by giving that suggestion, I am also helping to, I'm reinforcing this goal concept. I'm helping to teach this idea. Now, the second level is a directed question. So this is where you start to remove the scaffolding. You start to remove the support. Fido seems distracted. What do you think might be distracting him? Or there are a few options for working at his level to help him handle this distraction. We could move farther away from it. We could use better treats. Which do you want to try? So what we're doing here is we're still going over and helping, and we're pointing out the problem, but we're trying to get right away here. We move to this step as quickly as we can. We're trying to get the student to engage in the solution. Gosh, he looks distracted. What do you think might be distracting him? Now notice, remember in the previous slide, I said he's distracted by the dog who just came into this room. Now I'm saying, what do you think might be distracting him? And so I'm also helping them to practice a little bit of situational awareness, where they have to stop and look around the room. And it reminds them, oh yeah, I'm supposed to be doing that. And then I say there are a couple of things we could do to help work at his level. We could do this, or we could do this, or we could do this. So I'm still giving suggestions, but I am handing over some responsibility to the student by asking the student to decide which one to try. So this is just a gentle way of starting to remove their dependence on my direction. The third step is open questions. So I move from, he seems distracted, what do you think might be distracting him, to, Fido seems like he's having a hard time with this exercise. What do you think might be going on? So I'm not even going to point out that he's distracted. I'm just going to point out that he's having a hard time. What do you think might be going on? And then I say, what could you try to help him be successful? What could we do to work at his level? In the previous one, I said here are 2 or 3 options to choose from. Here I'm asking the student to recall what her options are, what strategies she has in her toolbox. So I'm just asking her to take more and more responsibility for noticing and solving these sorts of problems. And then what I'm looking for, what I'm headed toward, what I want to get every single one of my students to by the time they graduate is I want to, at least a good portion of the time, be able to just walk up to a student and say, I noticed that you backed up a ways when the new dog came into the room and you saw that Fido was struggling. Great decision. You're really working at his level. So what I'm looking for is those unprompted adjustments when they do something before I suggest or have to come in and help. And part of the art of this is stopping and watching your students, giving them a couple of seconds. It's just the same as, we're catching the students getting it right, just the same way we catch the dogs getting it right, is giving the student a second or two to process and make a decision. They're not going to notice as quickly that something in the room has changed. They're not going to notice as quickly that their dog's behavior has changed. They're not going to be as quick to fly into action and do something, but wait a couple of beats to see if they do, so that you have an opportunity to fly in and reinforce the heck out of it if they do something without your help. And then to step in and to really try to think about which level of support, 1, 2, or 3, you want to provide them if they don't go straight into action themselves. And so these are just some instructional strategies. And remember that the way we teach, the way we interact with students is part of our curriculum too. And so, a big part of a successful curriculum like this is making sure that we're not constantly feeding all the answers, that if we're going to teach people to be successful and thinking a little bit more like a dog trainer, we have to give them the opportunity to do a little bit more of their own thinking. Okay, and then I think I'm going to hand this back to Gina, who's going to wrap some of this up for us here.
Okay. So we have talked today about the many challenges that we face as teachers. Next time, we're going to take a look at the challenges that classes pose from a business perspective and how open enrollment can help us solve some of our business challenges. So that's what we'll do next time. But we hope that today, that by showing some examples of open enrollment, that we've given you some tools and some ideas or approaches about how you might face some of the challenges that we've been talking about to then go ahead and move your business forward. We're going to be opening things up for questions and answers here in just a minute, so just remind you that you can use the question and answer pod there to the left for that. Also, to let you know, if you did not see the open enrollment at a glance on your PowerPoint, it is in your email inbox if you want to take a closer look at that. I think the main thing we're going to point out there for you is just in the Company for Coffee session, you can see the different behaviors that led up to that final challenge, which you can also see in the curriculum example that we sent you with your slides. So just a chance if you want to go back and look at that, it's there. So while we switch things over, I am going to go ahead and get question and answers all queued up and ready to go. While I do that, Veronica is going to go over some special discounts and resources that might prove helpful for you.
Okay, fantastic. So I'm going to walk you through these, and if you have any questions, you can type those into the pod on the left there, and we'll go through those. As a thank you for attending today's web seminar, you have a standing $75 discount that you can use on Your Basic Manners curriculum, and you can just email us at dogtech.org to get that. If you want to learn a little bit more about the curriculum, the second box there has a link that you can use to go to the webpage about that and learn a little bit more about it and what's included in it and how that works. If you are like me and like Gina and I and sort of geek out a little bit on all of this curriculum stuff, this is a link here in the third box to an article about curriculum and curriculum design for dog trainers, and just to give a little bit more insight into some of the concepts that we talked about today. And if we can help you at all with your class program, this is a link that talks a little bit about the consulting work that we do for business consulting and class consulting as well, helping to solve classroom problems and that sort of thing. So those are some of the resources that are available for you. And then now we'll go into questions. I know that there was one that was really interesting that I had a little bit of dialogue with one of you about while Gina was instructing, and it was a really great question about would this kind of curriculum work well for a more advanced student? So somebody who was actually pretty savvy, who's done a lot of training, who maybe has a new puppy and is just going into class as a way of having a place to practice and that sort of thing. And actually, I think it's fabulous for those sorts of students. I think it's fantastic for new people who are, everyone from, you've got your brand new dog who, and a brand new dog owner, first time dog owner, how wonderful to start them off this way of really actually thinking in a more trainerly way, but also the folks that do have a lot of experience that are just looking for an opportunity to go work their dog somewhere. How wonderful then that they're working their dog in a context that they're doing the behaviors, but they're also having all of these opportunities to work at their own level in these lesson plans. Because one of the things I should have pointed out in a little bit more detail when we were looking at the Company for Coffee lesson plan is think about how that works. So, if I'm a brand new person and this is my first time in class, I'm approaching that challenge in a really simplistic way. If I've been there for 6 weeks, or if I'm this really savvy, dog owner we're talking about here, I'm approaching that challenge in a much, much higher level way. I'm bringing all the things I know to bear on it. So we can all go through these challenges, but we just go through them with bigger or smaller toolboxes, and also the pressure all the time to be working at our dog's level. So that was a great question. Gina, what other questions do we have?
We have another question from Donna about that it sounds like there could be a lot of lecture in a 1 hour class, and how do you mitigate that so that you don't get into too much talking and not enough working with the dog?
That's a great question. It probably looks like that more because there's so much writing. One of the things that I think always surprises people a little bit when they are looking at our curriculum at a workshop, for example, or at the APDT conference where they can actually go through it, is that they're sort of surprised by how much writing there is. And that's just because we're actually writing out a full curriculum, as a guide, so that people have something very close to follow. And I think we're so used to just seeing a simple sheet of paper that says, sit on verbal, down off verbal, as a curriculum. But the vast majority of that really is more instructional for the instructor about how to lay things out than it is actual talking. So if you look at our curriculum design, there's actually not a whole heck of a lot of the teacher talking. There's a little bit of introduction for things, certainly, but no more risk of standing up there talking too much than in the explain demo practice mode. What you do see is a little bit of time for discussion, which is unusual in most dog training classrooms, but which and I think which is always a little bit intimidating to people when they first look at our curriculum. But what's really interesting, I think we're so worried that we're going to be able to get the discussion going, but it's just about approaching it in a certain way, and that's all set up in the curriculum. And what we get reports back all the time is people saying, oh my gosh, it's actually amazing, it's working. People are talking and they're interacting and they're coming up with great ideas to then go out and try during the exercises. If you look closely at our curriculum, what you'll see is that the vast majority of it is people doing things, is taking what they're learning and actually actively going and doing it and interacting with their dogs, because that's the critical piece, right? I mean, we can talk at them all day long, but talking at people doesn't really teach them. And so,
Veronica, I would also just interject. I would also say that when you put in discussion, that feels like you're putting in talk time. But that's discussion is very different from the explain demo. That's you talking. Explain demo is you talking. Discussion is them talking and them processing. So from a student perspective, it doesn't feel like more talk time because they're active participants. It actually feels a little bit less because they're more active in the discussion as opposed to just passively taking in information. And there is still you can have discussion in your class and still have plenty of time to work the dogs too.
Great point. We have a question. Does the program cover an orientation people-only session prior to class starting? Absolutely. In open enrollment, you have three ways that you can do this. One is you can have a group orientation. So you hold orientation at a certain time or times, depending on the size of your program each week, and people are obligated to attend one of those before they jump in and start their class. Another option is to do private orientation, where you charge a bit more than other folks' classes, and your class is differentiated by the fact that it comes with a private jumpstart session before the first class. And then some people do a hybrid of that. They offer one price for the class, and that comes with the orientation, or you can pay a premium price and get a private jump start. And so if you are at a point in your business, if you do private training and you're trying to fill more private appointments, that's a really nice way to get some of those filled and also differentiate your class program from others.
And we've got a good question about, will this open enrollment format then eliminate the need for Puppy 1, Puppy 2, Intermediate, Advanced? It will it's going to change the way that you decide your topics for your classes. It doesn't mean that you will offer fewer classes. So, for instance, you may have different goals for your puppy owners than you have for your basic owners. So you may still have a basic and a puppy class. But remember, Veronica was talking about depth versus breadth. So because you're using this idea of teaching fewer cues to greater level, it means that you can have other classes that focuses on the cues that you didn't get to, or that you didn't use in basic. So it might not be that it's an intermediate class. They may be more topics driven. So it might be that you've got a class that's just focused on recall and you do tons and tons of recall in it, and take recall to a level that you didn't in your basic, if that's an area you didn't cover. So depending on how you design your curriculum, you're still going to be able to bring people back for multiple classes, but it may, rather than a level of class, basic, intermediate, advanced, you're bringing them back probably more for given topics.
And we're seeing that model play out really, really successfully for our clients, where they're using open enrollment classes as a foundation entry-level class. So you're coming in at puppy or you're coming in at basic. If you're coming in at puppy, you're probably then going into basic. And then after that, they're using shorter-run topics classes as a way to retain people and keep them in. And we're seeing the retention percentages go up much higher with this approach, partly because the classes are very focused on specific things that people want to master. Although if you look at the way, for example, that we design topics curriculum, that curriculum is still very, very focused on this working at your dog's level, real life problem solving, that sort of thing, but with a focus on these behavior vehicles as well. But then also because people are committing to shorter classes, they're committing to 3 or 4 sessions. One of the things we notice is that when we ask people to come back for another 6 weeks, another 6 weeks, another 6 weeks, that retention really drops off very quickly with this topics-based approach for the more sort of intermediate level, and advanced level, if you will. That retention numbers are much higher. And we've done a web seminar on topics classes that you can always check out the recording of as well if you're interested in that approach.
The other thing, because you're spending a lot of time talking with people about working at their level, you're setting up the expectation in the class that not everybody is at the same place. At the same time, it makes sense that when you end, you won't all be at the same place at the same time. And so what you'll find with this style of curriculum are people who are comfortable taking a class more than one time. We kind of have it set. As soon as you start having a basic 1 and a basic 2, you've set up this expectation that you take one and you go to the other. Whereas this kind of model tells people that it's okay to work on it at your pace, at your speed. It's okay to take it again. So you'll probably see a bit more of a few more people who are willing to go ahead and take it again to master it before going on and doing something else, and that you've set up the culture that works.
Yeah, and that's a great point, too. We're actually seeing quite a few people actively promoting that, where people are going through their basic twice, for example, because you imagine that you do, if you think about it, even if you don't change anything, even if you literally teach the exact same 6 sessions again, it's going to be a completely different experience the second time through, because it's all so focused on working at the dog's level to meet these challenges, and then the students get to, and so what you do the second time through is that the discussion questions change a tiny bit, where you're saying, okay, when you did this 6 weeks ago, and when you did this now, what has changed? What did you do differently? What changes have you noticed in your dog? So it's a really interesting, what do we still need to work on here? So it's a really interesting experience for people to see how far they've come, and to be able to say, okay, here are the things that are working, and here are the things that I still need to adjust. So yeah, it's actually a really powerful experience for people. Let's see, we've got one more question coming in here. Do we do the orientation class with or without dogs, and how long is it? Without dogs, because that really is an opportunity to lay some foundation concepts and get people ready for success. So give them an opportunity to really focus in and learn a few things so that when they have the distraction of their dogs with them, they're more prepared for that. And our orientation runs 60 minutes. And one of the things, if you have a real small class program, one of the tricks you can use if you're not interested in doing the private version of that is to have the orientation run the hour previous, so that if your classes are on Thursday evening, if your basic is on Thursday evening at 7:30, perhaps your orientation is Thursday at 6 o'clock, so that you know that if you have a smaller program and you're only offering it once, you know that it's in a spot that people will be able to attend easily. The third option too, I should have mentioned, for orientation. Now, the jury's out a little bit on this because we've got a few people who are experimenting with it, but it just hasn't been going on long enough to be able to confidently say how it's working. Some people are experimenting with videotaping the orientation and then sending that out as a link and asking people to watch it before class. Now, of course, you always run the risk that people aren't going to watch it, but it's sort of interesting. We've got a couple of people who have taped sort of a full-length orientation, and a couple of people who are experimenting with smaller bits. So, taking the 6 topics and doing a 10-minute piece on each. A 10-minute piece on how dogs learn, and a 10-minute piece on physical and mental stimulation, and a 10-minute piece on what to bring to class and how to prepare, whatnot, and sending them these smaller videos. And so we're sort of waiting to see the data on what the rate of compliance is. I think it's going to depend an awful lot on just the audience, part of the country they're in, and how tech savvy their particular student clientele is, that sort of thing. But that's another option to consider as well. And great question. Heather has a question about how do we handle missed classes. And we'll probably talk a little bit more about this sort of, kind of the more businessy aspect of things next week. But I tend to have a fairly draconian approach to this. My feeling is that adults need to be the masters of their own schedules, and that when we allow people to skip classes, when we say that it's okay for them to, they're more likely to do it. And that if we feel that training is really important, and if we feel and know that one of the more critical aspects of training is consistency, I think that it really behooves us to make it difficult for people to not be consistent. That I think we sometimes confuse a desire for customer service with a desire to make to sort of bend over backwards to accommodate everyone's busy lives. And the reality is that people are busy. That's part of why open enrollment works so well. But as soon as you start saying it's okay to skip class, people will do it. And so I tend to to feel that I think especially at the puppy stage, but really at any time, that it's important that once people have paid for something, that it's their choice whether to show up. I mean, if I pay to go to college and I don't show up at class, I don't get any money back, and it's really up to me to show. And if I pay for a place, in a private school for my child, and I keep her out to go to grandma's house or whatnot, that's on me. But it's not a reasonable expectation to ask the teacher to sit down and then do a whole separate piece. So it's up to you how you do it, but just remember that your admin life gets harder and harder the more you allow people to jump into extra classes and things like that. And so we'll probably talk a bit more about that next week. But in general, I wouldn't be too generous on those sorts of things, because it really isn't. I don't think it's in students' interests to set up a system where it's easy for them to skip class. I don't know, Gina, if you have any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. As soon as you give them the out, they take it. But I do have some clients who, if they do offer a makeup, they just make sure that the student comes, whenever that particular, if it's the coffee session, whenever the coffee session is going to be offered again. And we're going to talk next time about how to track that and how to track what students are coming what nights in the next web seminar.
All the practical details.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So then next week we'll be doing that. We'll be talking about the business aspect of it, everything from those practical setup details to the marketing element of it, pricing, all those sorts of good things. And we will look forward to being back with you then. Any last housekeeping issues, Gina?
No, that's all. Thank you guys, and we'll see you next time.
Looking forward to it. Take care, everyone.